Creepy and Geeky. Welcome to Creepy and Geeky, the double feature podcast of horror and more. I'm your host, Robert, and today is part 3 in our 4-part look at the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Kat Voleur returns to the show to talk all about Nightmares 4 and 5. Kat is the co-host of Slasher Radio and a writer whose debut book, Revenge Arc, is available for pre-order now and will be released in August. Welcome back to the show, Kat.
Thank you for having me back. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm super excited about this one, but I'm excited to talk about it. any chance to get to talk to you is always a fun time. So it's
I love being here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump right into it. We're gonna jump right into Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, the Dream Master. It took me a second to remember the subtitle on that. There 3, 4 and 5 are essentially a trilogy of themselves, the Dream Warriors, Dream Master, and Dream Child. So and they all kind of work together pretty well. So this one is interesting because it continues it continues the Kristen Parker storyline that was started in Dream Warriors, which obviously you know elephant in the room at the very beginning of this is that they couldn't get Patricia Arquette back, and so they went with a new actress, Tuesday Knight, who doesn't quite have the same qualities that Patricia Arquette had.
No.
But we don't get her very long. Joey and Kincaid from Dream Warriors, all who survived that one, they all get killed off really quickly in this one, and it's kind of a dick move.
It is kind of a dick move. It's one of those things where it's like, this does kind of round out the trilogy. It gives us closure. It gives us a connection to Dream Warriors, which was a fan favorite. Yes. I have for a long time said that Dream Master would be a much stronger movie. It would have better pacing, and really highlight its strengths if it had not started with those 3. Like, even though it was great to see them back, when you look at this just as a movie in its own right, the pacing is probably it's one of the worst areas of the movie, and it's because we do have all this time where instead of, developing the characters that we're focusing on, we waste a lot of time at the beginning of this movie, just killing off people from the last movie.
Right. Well, and part of me is like, well, why couldn't they just continue that story with Kristen and Joey and Kincaid? Like, why not continue their stories into this new one? Like it's just like, it's some kind of weird slasher trope that sure, they might survive the one but you're not going to survive the next one.
Right.
So it's a little weird. Although, going into this, we're talking about, because the only purpose they seem to serve is to then pass on Kristen's ability to pull people into her dreams into the new person, Alice. So it's like, that's literally the only reason for doing that, is to somehow pass that ability on.
And there were other ways that I feel like would have taken less time.
Right. Yeah.
That being said, I really love Dream Master.
Okay.
I don't love it as much as I did when I was a kid, but for whatever reason, this movie, this was my favorite thing ever, like, as a child watching horror movies. I don't know what part of this specific Nightmare on Elm Street was it, but like, I feel like I'm more into the genre because Dream Master was just so endlessly fascinating to me as a child. And we were talking about this before on Twitter, but my Nightmare on Elm Street rankings generally were just very unhinged. As a kid, this was the first like full franchise that I ever watched.
Okay.
Um, and because I got really into I watched Cube, and I was like, more R-rated horror for me, mom and dad. And then I started going to Blockbuster and picking up the classics because those were, the things that they were comfortable with me watching. And I started with Nightmare on Elm Street. It was my favorite for a long time. And but my rankings for it were just like, there was no rhyme or reason to which ones I did and did not like. Uh, and I held those opinions for a long, long time. And then on my on Slasher Radio, we ranked all of them one year, and I had to go back and rewatch all of them to kind of, and I thought I was just going to be like defending my opinions, and I went back and it's like, oh, these are all over the place. Like, some of these are not good, and Dream Master I think is kind of the one like holdover from that. Like, it used to be my favorite. It is no longer my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie. But I do like, even looking at it with all of its flaws, it's like I still have that nostalgia for it where I
Right.
remember when this was my favorite film.
It's definitely mid-range for me. Um it's not, I don't see it as necessarily being a bad one at all. I think that, the story that it continues from Dream Warriors is one of the better ones in the
Yeah.
series. But it's continuation. It's funny too because talk about this in some of the other episodes that with me growing up in the 80s, and this would have been the first Nightmare came out when I was 10.
Hmm.
And so I was prime age for um this whole series. And so when Dream Master came out, what, 88, then I would have been 14. So
Oh yeah.
perfect teenage, like, the perfect age range for these movies as a whole. And I love these movies. Like, the whole series was like entertaining, and part of that is because at the time, Freddy Krueger became a huge cultural phenomenon. Um, and for the most part, I think it's this trilogy of movies, 3, 4, and 5, that really cement him in that in that place. Because you get the mix of the horror, the comedy, the hair metal music that runs through a lot of it. That, and watching these again with and 4 and 5 specifically, they are heavily 80s.
Oh
What
yeah.
we kind of think of the 80s, like big hair, the spandex, all of that, kind of, you see that in this late 80s range of movies. The both 4 and 5 are 88 and 89, and that's where you kind of like, it's weird, like, realistically, like, I would say maybe 86 to 89 is kind of where we think of in terms of 80s, like, nostalgia. um
Yeah.
and so the especially 4 and 5, they've got like all the big hair, the goofiness. The brother is like really into karate, and that was
Yeah.
a holdover from like the whole Karate Kid era. And it's this huge, like, I don't know. And so for me, like, growing up, I really liked these, and I liked Freddy more than any of the other stuff at that time, in terms of when I did watch horror stuff, because I wasn't as big into horror then. I liked horror movies, but I wasn't as big into it then. And so, but in terms of that, it was one of those ones that I liked a lot. And again, because Freddy was just everywhere, and everybody loved Freddy, and he was all over the place. And it's funny when rewatching these movies is that he really doesn't have that much screen time um
No.
in any of these. And so, like, you think of him as this quippy one-liner, and don't get me wrong, he does have the one-liners and stuff, but it's like real quick here and there. He dispatches them fast, and it's done, and he's gone. And then we get the drama, of them trying to stay awake and all the other stuff that's going on. And so it's funny how much of our perception of Freddy was influenced not necessarily by the movies, but also by him just being in pop culture everywhere. Um,
Yeah.
so
And I
because he
think,
was referenced in everything, and he would pop up in commercials, and it was just crazy. So go ahead.
oh, I also think that like I feel like Freddy has a lot of screen time, but a big part of that is because he has so much more screen time than like Jason or Michael or, you know, especially in the early like entries for those.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah,
It's
the pop culture thing also has because even before that has just persisted, and that's one of those things where like you can't live in the world without knowing who Freddy Krueger is,
yeah.
regardless of whether or not. When we did the when I ranked all of these, I actually my partner watched them for the first time because he's not like a big horror guy.
Okay.
Um, that's changed since then because
Right.
just being around me, you end up seeing a lot of horror movies that you don't expect.
Right. Right.
Um, but like at the time, I made sure that he was with me when I watched them because I knew he'd never seen any of them. But like even before that, um, we when we would talk horror, Freddy was like one of the big ones that he was kind of drawn to. And it makes sense because he's everywhere. You know who he is. You know the
Yeah.
story. Like that's all worked
Right.
into his design as a character. But he still has that like kind of funny that Freddy, I think, is the most charismatic of like the slasher
Yeah,
icons.
because he's actually has a personality. Jason and Michael. If you think of like what I call the unholy three, you've got Michael, Jason, and Freddy. And Michael and
Yeah.
Jason, they don't talk. Neither one talk. They have no personalities. They're just straight ahead killers. And Freddy's actually got personality. He talks. He's sadistic. There's just he's on another level, and I think that's what appeals in general for most people because he's accessible in a way that the other two aren't, and that a lot of slashers of the genre aren't. So
And one persisting thing that I have with Dream Master, a lot of the things that I liked were kind of silly, but I do think Dream Master has like a couple really good strengths that get overlooked sometimes.
right,
One I do think is its characterization of Freddy. I know a lot of people strongly either prefer funny Freddy from the later entries or scary Freddy from the early entries. I think Dream Master is the best balanced between those two. Like he's doing the one-liners, he's being very silly, he's having a lot of fun with it, but the deaths are all so personal and
right.
horrific and just like very there was still that horror element that I think gets lost pretty much immediately after this. I think in Dream Child it gets lost some.
Yeah,
Not that they weren't creative, but I just like Dream
yeah,
Master I think is the last like scary one.
yeah. I think you're right. I think that after this point they just get progressively silly, and he gets sillier. I mean, and it only really exists in the next two entries, because
Right.
after that we get Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and he's not silly or really even funny at all in that. Um,
And then they really ran with that for the remake.
yeah, 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 yeah. I go into the remake of the first episode, so um, but yeah, no, it's I think that the Freddy that's in this one strikes a decent balance, and the characters overall in this, the kid characters that he's killing off, they're all fairly well, thought out and fleshed out and everything. We don't get a whole lot of time spent with all of them, um,
Right.
which is typical in slasher movies. You just get archetypes more than anything. And this one more than, and see, with Jason and Freddy, or with Jason and Michael, you kind of want the 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 victims, to be a little more fleshed out because Michael and Jason are so quiet and they don't, there's nothing to them. Um,
Right.
but in these movies, Freddy's the star. It's not about who the victims are really. And so it's a different balance. And I think again, that's where Freddy became, a much brighter star than either of the other ones, because he had that, um, at least for that time period, because he had that personality. And again, I think that had a lot to do with the popularity of the character as well. So,
I think so.
that's not to, like I said, it's the characters in this are fairly well fleshed out. I mean, again, they're just archetypes. I mean, I do think it's interesting that we get kind of the jock girl in this than the jock guy.
Yeah.
We do have a jock guy, don't get me wrong, but in Dan, he seems kind of jockish, not too bad. But we get the girl who's all about exercise and all that. So Debbie. So it's interesting. It's a nice little twist on some stuff. You get the nerdy black girl character. So there's these nice little twists, not necessarily twists, but nice little deviations of the norm. So
And I really like with Debbie and the oh god, I don't remember her name. Uh but the our nerdy girl. I like that they're friends. I
yeah,
like and it's one thing because it's like aside from just like kind of subverting that, like jock versus nerd thing, I there are not a lot of horror movies of this era that have convincing friends. Like
right.
you have this group of teenagers that's hanging out together, but you never really know why, and it's one thing like in Friday the 13th, they're just kind of all tossed together. They're the counselors, and it's like,
Right.
okay, sure. But then like in Halloween, you're like, what do these friends have in common? And these
Right.
they have the different archetypes, but you feel like they have good chemistry also,
Mm-hmm.
like you feel these are a group of teenagers that would hang out together and be friends. um
Yeah, I think as somebody who grew up in the 80s and was a teenager at the time that these movies were, put out, that I feel like that's fairly accurate. Like, they want to, even movies at the time, they were always trying to, put us into these little subcultures, the jocks and the nerds and everything else. But myself, I was a what I was a loner. But I could coexist between groups for the most part. Not really with the jocks because I wasn't a sports guy at all. Never have been, never will be. But I knew people like that. I knew cheerleaders. I knew football players. They were all friendly with me. I even worked in the lunch line, as nerdy as that is, and they would still say hi to me. And so I was never picked on by those kids, and so it was kind of interesting to watch this in movies where those kind of kids were picked on for whatever reasons and everything. It just would always have that, like, and so that was with this movie. It was kind of interesting to see that, like you said, the nerdy girl and the jock girl, they're kind of giving each other shit, but friendly, like friends do. And so that
yeah.
was nice to see.
And I think like characterization was the other big thing that I think has aged really well with the Dream Master, and not all of the maybe not all of the Nightmare on Elm Streets. But I do think they
Yeah.
did a really good job with Dream Master. Um Alice, I think, is a fantastic final girl. I think overall, A Nightmare on Elm Street has the best final girls. Like we have more than one memorable final girl from this franchise, which is not something that we always. I get Halloween also has that to an extent, um,
Yeah.
but something that I really appreciate is that I don't think Alice is necessarily like a better final girl than Nancy. They start off great because
No.
Nancy's
Yeah.
just such a badass.
Yeah.
But I do really appreciate in Dream Master, Alice has a full arc, like we really get to see her
Yeah.
come into her own, um, which is
Yeah,
doubly
and
impressive.
they make a point of showing each moment when like one of her friends dies. She takes the picture off the mirror, and that kind
Yeah.
of just it's and she sees more of herself in the mirror because in the beginning she's got the mirror all covered up. She doesn't care about how she looks, blah blah blah. And then as she pulls pictures off the mirror, which is a weird thing to do, like instead of putting pictures up to memorialize your friends, you're kind of pulling them off. It was a weird thing while I was watching. It's like, why are you pulling those down? But every time she pulled it down, she'd see a little bit more of herself in the mirror, and it kind of like, I don't know, emboldened her in a way
Yeah.
that gave her strength in a way to see herself, still alive. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Like, okay, I'm putting my friend away who's dead, and now I'm still alive, so I'm bigger and tougher now. Like, it was a weird thing. It may have just been my thoughts, but
Yeah, I had never thought of it that way.
yeah,
In that regard, it definitely is a little bit strange, but I do really appreciate that we do kind of get to see that evolution of her
yeah,
character. And it's especially impressive because, as we already talked about, so much of the movie is not spent developing her; it's spent killing
right,
off her other friends,
yeah,
to kind of make the plot able to happen. I think if the whole movie had been, of course, there's also a real chance that they would have just added more mirror montage scenes instead of like spending that time
yeah.
wisely. But I do sometimes think that if this had been like a full Alice, if instead of wrapping up the Kristen trilogy, if this had started an Alice trilogy, it maybe like it. I think this could have been a better movie than it was, but I am kind of surprised at how well it has held up.
It's interesting too because so going into my whole thing about that, about how she takes the mirror down, like takes the pictures off the mirror and stuff, she does have pieces like touchstones from her friends. She's got the weird little device from the nerdy girl, I think she was Sheila.
Sheila,
um
yeah.
and then she's got the studded bracelet from Debbie, and she's got her brother's headband. And so it's so she's got all these little bits that she later combines into her look, her badass look, quote unquote. um uh which
Yeah.
is so funny too, because like I was reading the things and they were talking about how like when she originally auditioned for the role, she was too put together for them. They wanted somebody who could be mousy in the beginning and then could be badass in the end. Um, which is fine. But like she didn't change all that much from being the mousy version of herself. She put on a jacket and the other stuff that she added to her thing, and that made her badass.
I
The 80s, man, I don't know.
I will say, that was one thing as that might have been my biggest disappointment on the rewatch, because like I remember being a kid and being like, "Oh, she's so cool now. I'm gonna be just like this someday." Apparently, I wanted a leather jacket. I don't like. I remember watching that like makeover scene, the reverse. I don't know what you call it, but I remember watching it as an adult and being like, "Why? What was my obsession here?"
So funny. So it's funny too because they called this like so apparently this was like the MTV I don't know how they put it, but it was something when I was reading up on it, they called it like the MTV Freddy or something. And so the MTV Nightmare. And I get it, it was kind of that era. And so it's very much kind of glossy, a little bit more glossy than some of the other ones earlier and stuff. And uh but again, I think that goes into what I was saying earlier about what we know, what we look back at the 80s and think of is that kind of like I said, the big hair and everything. And so I can see that why people would call it that in that way,
Yeah.
especially if you got the music in there and everything else. It's a whole thing. So, but yeah, I literally binge watched all of these yesterday in preparation because you're actually my first recording of these.
Oh,
Yeah, so I was like, okay, I need to watch the first three before I get to 4 and 5, so I know where I'm at in the whole sequence of things. So over the last few days, I've been watching all of these. So it's been crazy.
I ended up watching, I didn't watch them in order, and I wish that I had known that I was going to watch all of them because I probably would have just done that. It does not take a lot for me to sit down and marathon on Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah,
But I started with 4 and 5 because I knew I was doing this, and it's like I should rewatch those. And then because I'd already seen those, it was like, well, I'll just go ahead and put on 6. And it was like, well, I've seen this half. I might as well go back. So
that's
I did
funny.
like a 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3 marathon.
That's probably not the best way to watch them.
It's not ideal. It's
No,
not
no.
terrible though because it ends with Dream Warriors, which usually you
Yes.
don't need
Yeah,
to end
yeah.
on
That's
that
not
high of
that's
a
not
note.
and I would say generally speaking, at least for me, I would say 1, 2, and 3 are the better. Like if you're just
Oh,
watching the
absolutely.
first six, that 1, 2, and 3 are basically the best ones. And then 3, 4, or 4, 5, and 6 are kind of Um,
I, I do think my hottest take is that if I had 3, I would take 1, 3, and 4. But a lot of that I know is nostalgia.
yeah. After
And
having watched these, I would say if I only got to choose three to watch, I would choose 1, 3, and New Nightmare. So
yeah,
that's my hot take, which I don't think is really that big of a hot
I
take.
don't
I
think
think
that's that
generally
big a
speaking, that's those are actually the best movies of the whole franchise. So it's kind of
yeah.
uh but
Um,
yeah. Going
my
back to number
other
4, which we're actually talking about.
yes.
And four, like I said, 4 is not bad. It's very middle of the road for me. I gave it 3 stars on Letterboxd yesterday. So it's an okay movie. And most of this series, I hadn't seen them in quite a long time, probably since most of them came out. I had watched 1 through 3 a couple of years ago. I bought the box set of the first 7 movies. Um,
Mhm.
and uh 1 through New Nightmare. And I only got up to number 3 before I petered out when I was trying to watch them before. And so going back through these again, I didn't remember anything of 4 on. And so I know I'd seen 4, 5, and 6 before, but I didn't remember any of them. So uh and like I said, for those especially, it hadn't been since the 80s/90s since I had watched them. So it's been quite some time.
I remembered I think before I did my rewatch, I remembered one really well because it was one that I would still rewatch
Yeah.
fairly regularly. I remembered 4 really well because I watched it so much as a kid. And I remembered 6 really well, and I could not for the life of you tell you what it was about 6 that left. I It might have been because I got the DVD box set when I was a kid.
Okay.
Uh
Yeah.
and it had like the 3D glasses is the only
Oh
thing
yeah.
like I had to put on special glasses to watch 6 and that was kind of cool and somewhere that left an impression on me where it was like 6 is fun. That is actually my you get my other Nightmare on Elm Street hot take today. I think Dream Warriors. I think Dream Master is severely underrated. My big hot take is that Dream Child is the worst one. I uh I know for a lot of people that like they should have quit doing these point was 6. But I cannot for the like I don't get Dream Child. I don't like it. I don't think it's good. It ruined Alice for me, which was rough. And honestly, having just watched like the main six, I honestly think that I would rather watch the remake than Dream Child.
Oh wow. Well,
I didn't, but
Dream Child is definitely my second least favorite. Final Nightmare, just and I'll be going into this in another episode, but yeah, it's just for me that's the worst one of the bunch.
I think that's
But
the like I think that's where most people kind of have them ranked.
yeah.
I know when we did the rankings, everyone got like really just like baffled by me because we started from the bottom and worked our way up, and I came hot out of the gate. I was like, Dream Child, we all agree, right? And everyone's like, no, nobody agrees with you there. But and the thing that kills me about Dream Child is it had cool ideas, uh, that doesn't it has cool ideas that A are not medically accurate and B they don't spend any time on because they're like, what if instead we have Alice talk to this creepy little dork of a kid that's hers? It's like I hate it. I
Yeah.
hate it so much.
No, yeah. So yeah, Dream Child is I'll admit is a mess of a movie. It just barely edges out Final Nightmare for me. Um, it takes everything that was like even remotely good with Dream Master and just kind of like shits it all.
Yeah.
Um, she gets this whole new group of friends that like I'm sorry, but you've been through this weird traumatic event and everything like that. And it's the weirdest thing that like these movies, like everybody seems to forget who Freddy Krueger is every time. Like, and
Every
I
single
get I
time.
get that he's not talked about, don't get me wrong, but amongst the kids, you would think that he would become something of a talked thing.
Yeah.
Um and so it always baffles me every time we get to another movie and like, nobody knows who he is. Um so um and I get I get if you're not one of the children of Elm Street that it shouldn't be, you know, but that was the whole point of Dream Master was that now he can jump over to somebody else. That was, he wanted to claim more victims and now that all the Elm Street children are dead, he needed more. And so that's why he jumped over to Alice. And
Yeah.
so it's like, well, being friends with Alice is probably a bad idea. So
Probably. Yeah. And she's just like living her best life when Dream Child opens up. Like she's not I and it's one of those things because she does have like this whole very powerful arc. So it's not necessarily that I wanted to see her go back to being like messy and, scared and stuff, but I do
right.
think just having been through something like that, there should have been some kind of indicator of like, hey, I'm watching out for my new friends. I'm practicing my dream master abilities in this way so I can protect my friends if Freddy comes back. Like she really seems to have put it behind her when
Yeah.
the movie opens up, and and then yeah, there's the sequence where she has to like try to explain to everyone who Freddy Krueger is, and it's like if I knew that Freddy Krueger was passing potentially to my friend's dreams and then I defeated him, I would maybe warn my next group of
Yeah.
friends.
Like
Like,
immediately warn your friends. Like what the
yeah,
hell? And see,
and
my problem is I think that they shouldn't like each movie should have been a new group of kids. Like it shouldn't have
yeah,
continued on like that. And if you are going to continue with some character that from a previous thing, you have them come in midway through or something to be the person who explains it. Kind of like what they did with Nancy in number 3.
yeah,
So it's I think that would have been the better way of doing it instead of focusing back on the same character again, fighting him again. And it didn't make sense in the overall to continue Alice's story.
no,
Um, and it's the same thing. Like, I mean, they basically, you know, as much as I think it's weird that they brought in Kristen and Joey and Kincaid from number 3 into 4, like that her whole purpose for that was to, pass on her ability to Alice. If you're going to bring Alice into another one, do the same thing, pass on her ability or pass on knowledge or something, but then get out of the way and give us the new group of kids. I mean, other slashers do it in a better way of doing that, so and with this, because it's Freddy and because it's a different type of slasher, because see, I don't see this as necessarily being, I know it's considered a slasher series, but it's so much more than that.
It is.
And
It's one of
it's
those
weird to lump it into the slasher genre.
hard to
So
define. Like, when I do really love how, because like the slasher genre, we have all of these, like masked uh killers that just go after
mostly
teens.
quiet. Yeah.
That's kind of what we think of when we think of the slasher genre, but when people list like their favorite slashers, it very quickly devolves into paranormal films. Like
Yeah.
Freddy's kind of that gateway, and then we've got, like Candyman and
Yeah.
then we
And I
start
don't
getting
see
into like the
Candyman as a
whole
slasher either. Like that's
I don't really.
that's it's so weird. Yeah.
But
Like
then and like
Chucky's a
Pinhead
slasher.
is
I'll take
another
that
one.
one.
Chucky, at least, yeah, there's a paranormal element to the movies, but he
Yeah.
slashes is like the thing that
Yeah.
he does.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I get that. Like, I get that with Freddy, the Nightmare on Elm Street movies are slashers. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're not. I just saying they're more than just a slasher. It's a combination. It's this
yeah.
supernatural slasher. Like, there's more going on there than just your typical slasher thing. So sorry.
Sometimes too much going on, which I
Yeah,
think was
yeah.
the thing with Dream Child. And I completely agree with you. I think because Nightmare on Elm Street was so ambitious, they maybe should have tried to figure out their own format for what did and didn't work. Like we've got the Jamie trilogy in Halloween. We've got we've got the Tommy Jarvis trilogy in
Yeah.
Friday. Uh, I understand that there's like that this was something that had been done in slashers where we have like these arcs with survivors, even if they don't
Right.
necessarily make it. But it is, I, when you're tackling so much more than the average slasher, I don't think there's any reason why they had to work within those constraints the way that they chose to. And it is, I get more frustrated with it in Dream Child than any of the other ones. I On paper, though, I think it's almost a really interesting concept, Dream Child, because this is kind of it's one of the you could argue that it was done with Nancy also because she leaves and she comes back having gone to college and
Right.
made a life for herself. But Alice could have been like the first slasher that like or the first slasher protagonist that we really get to see like growing up with this kind of trauma, like a lot of times, and Tommy Jarvis again, we get to see him, from like a child to a young adult, but it's like, but we don't get to see that process. Alice is at an age where it's like we actually get to see her becoming an adult and taking steps into those adult life things. She's her and Dan, I think, are engaged. And they're like they've moved in and they're having a kid now, and it's like I do think it's a really interesting point in someone's life to have a slasher story, especially with a character that we knew in high school, but it's like but they missed the mark so terribly that it's hard to give them credit for that.
Right.
And especially because like she's still technically in she's still hanging out with like a different high school crowd. It doesn't move far enough away into like Alice is an adult who has plans for her future other than, like a trip to Paris, which was kind of disappointing.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is that they're trying to also define, like through this trilogy, 3, 4, and 5, that they're trying to do this thing, and we get more of it in 5. We get Freddy's backstory. We get this. We get some of it. Um, we get his mother's backstory anyway. That he was born of this woman who was a nun, and she got trapped in this sanitarium with 100 lunatics, and they took advantage of her, and so he was the son of 1,000 or son of 100 maniacs.
Son of 100 Maniacs. And I think that is it's one of the dumbest Easter eggs in a movie
Yeah.
ever because it's like, you know, she was violently attacked and, so, they all were with her and the son of 100 Maniacs. One of them is literally Robert Englund.
Robert England,
It's like,
yeah.
I have an idea. I know exactly which maniac it was.
Right.
If I
I
had
think
to,
I might
like,
know.
but like I do think the combination of like that voiceover with the actual shot of Robert England in the sanitarium is like it's unintentionally very funny and I feel bad laughing about it, but also hi.
But it sets up like this, or it doesn't set up. We get kind of we get this past of his, and so the way to stop him this time. So each time in these last 3 movies, I go into number 3 in the previous episode about but in number 4 she stops him with the nursery rhyme and a mirror, or not
Yeah.
with the was it the mirror, or was the mirror in this one? They all kind of blended together.
I
Um,
Yeah, it was the mirror um Dream
in number
Master.
4.
But
Okay. So with the mirror and the nursery rhyme, and basically her friends' souls who are all attached to him revolt and like pull away from him. And
yeah.
that's like how he loses his power. And meanwhile, she's got the power of her friends inside of her as well. He's got their souls, but she's got their power. Um, and so it's like,
And
okay,
this
but
one she just has to
how
go
does that
tell
work?
his mom.
Yeah, and then she has to go free his mom. So go free her from the her resting place, which was not, because she I don't know, for some reason her soul is trapped in this tower, and so and just breaking open the tower frees her soul. And so it's just this weird storyline that exists through all of this that doesn't play. You don't really get kind of payoff as to what Freddy really is until number 6, which is fine. It's kind of like it's interesting to have this storyline go through these to and meanwhile I'm sitting there theorizing like the whole time. I was like, this would be better if it had you know this idea, and the idea that I had came true in number 6, and so then afterward I was like, did I come up with that while watching these, or did I just somehow subconsciously remember that this whole time? um and so it's but they just don't pull it off that well.
No.
It's I don't know like how, like I don't know that if anybody can pull it off well enough. I think somebody could. I think that the general idea of it is sound, that because we get an even better version of it kind of in New Nightmare, and again I'm going to talk about that in a different episode. But the seeds of it are all laid here. Basically, demons and everything, and so because and that he's basically kind of eternal. It
Yeah.
is, as much as you stop him, he'll always come back. That he just needs to kill like new kids, and we kind of get this distilled really well and I know some people really don't like this movie, but Freddy versus Jason is really good distillation of both of their storylines.
It
Um,
is.
and
It's
it's like,
fun.
honestly, it's probably Freddy versus Jason is one of the best Freddy iterations there is. It's just it tells a simple story. It's got everything about him just works without it being you know bad at all. And so I think that him needing people to believe in him and to know who he is what gives him that power, is what gives him power. And so I think that's an interesting take that we continue to get. And that's what, with the death of the Elm Street kids, he needed to continue to terrorize other kids to continue to exist. And so each time he's defeated, then he needs to, poke his head out and, kind of, get reawakened in a way. So,
and I think that's I really like that they get back around to that concept because it was something that they had in the early Elm Street movies. And right around here, they do sort of seem to lose it,
yeah,
where it's like, it's demons. It's the, he was
yeah,
evil from the beginning. It was, they get into it a little bit too, where it's like with his stepdad in the next one. But like right around here, those waters get really muddied from a really
yeah,
interesting concept of our fear of a thing gives it power over us, which I think is
yes,
a very powerful. It's something that makes the movies scarier, and I do like that they eventually get back around to that in the
yeah.
franchise because
I mean,
it's
it's literally how Nancy defeats him in the first movie is just,
yeah.
I have the power over you. I am choosing not to believe in you. And that works,
Works.
you know,
Yeah.
for a little bit, again, it's just for a
Other
little
than
bit.
studio interference, it definitely
Yeah.
works.
Yeah. So I do
But
think it's an
yeah,
interesting concept.
it's something where that we miss in these middle entries. I think especially Dream Child, they lean, and I'm a little bit torn because I do like, as you said, that the Freddy history is kind of worked in through the franchise. I think a lot of slasher franchises of this time sort of try to expand on a slasher's mythology in a way
Right.
where
Yep.
it's like, what would be interesting to do now? But Freddy, they did really try to go a different angle where it's like, what more can we reveal about what made him this way?
Yeah.
Which it kind of comes to a head in Dream Child where they go back to how he was born and how his mother dealt with him and or lack thereof. I guess she ended up not
Yeah.
really dealing with him until this movie. But it's and I think it's a really that's one of my favorite things for storytelling in horror franchises. It's something that I think is done better. It's one thing I like about more modern franchises. It is because the mythology I think is kind of established more cohesively. Uh,
Yeah.
but Nightmare on Elm Street did kind of start that trend. So even though I Dream Child, especially, and then more in Final Nightmare, like they do have these like they tried to go too much into the like religious
Yeah,
mythology
and they also
a
try to
bit.
over they do a job of over explaining and like giving us too much of his past history. Like,
Yeah,
they go into it a little too deeply and it's like, well, we don't need that, it's we get it,
and
it's
it's a
fine,
double-edged
but I think that's
sword
why.
because I do like
Yeah.
that there's a through line, but it took the focus from the things of Freddy that worked, you know.
Yes.
Which I guess also I said that we do it more now in we do it better in modern franchises. That's also something that the Conjuring universe is very guilty of because it started with like it started with a haunted house and then it's like, how do we get the Vatican involved in this? And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, you don't do that. Nobody
Yeah,
wanted
my
that.
hot take is I don't really like the Conjuring universe. So
I don't like the Conjuring universe.
it's like, especially with, because the characters are very like based on very problematic people on
They
top of
are.
everything else that is going on with that. It's just like, no. Like if they had taken like honestly, like Conjuring I think would be, only slightly better if they had taken, like, based it on those people and made them into different characters, not called them the Warrens, and just made them
Yeah.
wholly new characters. I think that would have, like, I mean, obviously the Conjuring universe is very, you know, uh, um popular and profitable. But I just think that, it would have been even more so for those of us who don't care all that much about that stuff. And actually the whole Warren stuff bothers us. That it would make it a little bit more palatable. So,
That would have
but
been I so overall I think we're better at it, but we do it's so funny. It wasn't until I was bringing up the religious stuff that it's like, "Oh, wait a minute."
yeah,
We also have one of those in the 2010s like
yeah, yeah,
but like with the
yeah,
character backstory and I'm going to behave and rein myself in because I'm going to be back talking about this with you later. But it's one of my favorite elements of Saw as a
oh
franchise
yes,
is that with the exception of Spiral, which I refuse to acknowledge as part of the Saw canon, they do all kind of have a very cohesive vision of who John Kramer is.
yeah,
And we have that like backstory, but they didn't make him a demon. They didn't
yeah,
ever take away like what worked about his I think his ethos kind of falters in some of the early ones, but for the most part it was like here's the guy, here's how we're going to expand on like what makes him a killer and scary and I do think that the first like time that I ever developed an appreciation for that kind of storytelling was in A Nightmare on Elm Street because even though the demon stuff doesn't work for me, it was really interesting to have like deep lore around a serial killer more than just like
yeah.
electricity brought him back. You're like, okay, I guess.
Well, see, and I
Sure.
think the demon stuff actually works for me. Like, that aspect of it, because part of that goes into what what Wes Craven's original idea for it all was too, was that basically, there's this, you know, people have been having this kind of stuff happening to them for, centuries, and what could be causing this, and so I think that through line that you get to it, through these movies, it is there, but it's just, it's kind of peppered in here and there, before we get into it. And I think the problem is that when we finally get to it in the end, with number six, that, it just kind of falls flat. And I think, and I'm definitely going to get into this with number six, but it definitely just, it just, because it wasn't there from the beginning, I think it's harder to digest. Um,
Yeah.
and and I think he does. I think that's why Wes Craven comes back and is like, look, here's what I'm doing, and I'm going to do, basically I'm going to kind of put it in context of how I wanted to do it in the first place, and how I think it should have been done from that point on. um
Yeah.
and then with New Nightmare, they're just like, okay, well then we're done. um but it's just, I don't know, with four and five, I think that ultimately with these two movies, they complete that trilogy that started with Dream Warriors.
Mhm.
We get, Kristen in the first one, part of the second one, and then it moves on to Alice for the bulk of two, or the bulk of four and all of five. And again, I really think that it would have been better suited if we had, you know like, maybe if Alice died in, the beginning of five, and transitioned to a new group of kids, just kind of like do that same thing over and over again, or have her not be in five until maybe midway, and just be like the Nancy that comes in and, kind of advises the group and helps them, and, whatever. But, it just, five definitely doesn't work as well, because it's like, okay, well, we already had Alice, let's, move on to somebody else. And, you know
Yeah, it
but
I think I maintain that there was a way that it could have worked, but it's one of those kind of like it's a moot point because they didn't do that. They gave us
yeah,
this. And it's
yes, exactly.
uh
Missed opportunities. It's interesting though too, because it's like there's definitely people who were working in the background of all this stuff, notably Robert Shea and, Rachel Talalay, um who were producers on a good many of these. And, as much as they could have had that guiding hand, and I think they do to a degree, because there's definitely a through line with these movies. It just, there's still pieces that aren't picked up in the right ways, that, on hindsight, I mean, obviously these movies were very popular at the time. Like they pretty much after each one they were pretty much like, okay, well this will probably be the last one. But they proved so popular. It's kind of like, again, going back to what you said about the Saw franchise. The Saw franchise only continued because every installment was very popular. Um,
Yeah.
which is kind of why like they kill John Kramer off and they're kind of like, oh fuck, what do we do now? Like these are still
Yeah.
so popular. Okay, let's kind of weirdly bring him back some way.
We've
So just put a backwards baseball cap on him. um,
problem solved.
yeah, problem solved. But yeah, I think that, and what's nice about this series though too is that this one, like as much as it would be interesting to see somebody kind of go back and try again, um,
Yeah.
that this series ends at number 6. Um, and they've done 2 attempts after that with New Nightmare and the 2010 Nightmare, that they've kind of done little attempts to not necessarily restart, but to do a different story on them. Then I think it's interesting that they stopped it, like, because they definitely stopped it with number 6 with Freddy's Dead. They were making a point. Robert
Yeah.
Shea was just like, look, these did well for me. It built New Line Cinema. It helped me out, but we want to move on to different things. The number 5 didn't do well enough. So they were just like, let's do one more. Let's kill them off. We'll be done, and that'll be over. And that's what they did. So
Yeah.
and so it's interesting that they pulled that off like in that way. And I think that because 5 just was kind of stinky, that and Dreamchild was like, even back then it just did not do well. I mean, which is funny though too when you look back at the trajectory of these movies in comparison to I would say its closest competitor, which would be the Friday the 13th series at the time, that these came out 4 and 5 came out 88 89 at the same time that 7 and 8 of the Friday the 13th series came out, and so which were both not great entries in that franchise either.
Both
And
decades, no.
they both kind of killed the franchise for a few years, not a whole lot, not super long time, but being that they were being pumped out year after year, um once they came out, that they kind of killed the franchises for a little bit. So it's funny. I think it just by 89 people are just like, okay, we've had enough. So
I
we
do
want
think it's
something
really
different.
interesting looking at Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th because they were different vibes, even though they were following like very
Totally. Yeah.
similar trajectories. But then they both have like this whole uh, there's that whole thing in uh Jason Goes to Hell where they have like the little teaser where it's
Yeah.
like because they like the last Nightmare on Elm Street before then got very silly. And then they have like that little teaser at the end of Jason Goes to Hell, and then they have Jason X, which also gets very silly. And
Yeah.
then they have like and then Nightmare on Elm Street got like one more serious entry. We're doing it's like a new
Yeah.
night. We're going back to the roots. We're gonna make Freddy, like a scary dude again. And then we have Freddy versus Jason, where it's like back to the teaser thing that we teased. And it's like,
Yeah.
what is
Yeah.
going on?
That's a
They
new line for you.
almost had so much forethought in setting that up, and then like they
Well,
faltered there, but it's
part of that is just because Freddy versus Jason took so long to get like off the ground. They
yeah.
like, I mean, I think the original plan was to do um Jason Goes to Hell and then do Freddy versus Jason almost immediately afterward. And because
And
they couldn't get Freddy versus Jason off the ground, they were like, okay, well, Wes Craven, why don't we pick up this idea you had? Because his idea, and again, I'm going to go into this later, but his idea for New Nightmare was actually an idea he had back when he was writing Dream Warriors. And so it they said no then, and they were like, okay. And so later on he got to pull it back out and do it again. And so because he so while they were waiting for Freddy versus Jason to get done, they did New Nightmare, so which was
Yeah.
like completely like out of continuity with everything else. So
Which is and it is I do think it's very funny. It's also a little bit sad though, because Freddy Krueger almost out of all of the classics has like the most coherent timeline.
it
And
does fairly. It's actually fairly coherent. Yeah.
yeah, like it stumbles right there a little bit at the end, but it's pretty. I'm impressed by how cohesive it is. Unlike because like Halloween was really guilty of this, and I don't talk about it a lot. But the the Texas Chainsaw Massacre timeline is
Oh,
such
that's
a
a mess.
mess.
That's just
Uh,
ridiculous.
you look at all these classics and it's like how does anyone follow any of these films? You need like charts and one of the cork boards and stuff for a lot of the
Right.
classic where it's like these three are in this canon and you
Well,
know.
and I think that's what's interesting. Like with Freddy and Jason, their stuff is just straight through. It's just you can watch all their movies and they're pretty much just straight through. Freddy versus Jason kind of, obviously sits, I would say, before Jason X. Obviously, it's after Jason Goes to Hell, but before Jason X. And and New Nightmares is a completely separate thing. But Freddy 1 through 6 to Freddy versus Jason. So I mean, it's fairly with those two, their timelines are great. Halloween, um, 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 and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, their timelines are just fully messed up,
Yeah,
and so
they're
it's just
okay.
ridiculous. Yeah.
And then there's
So,
like the thing with Hellraiser where it's like we have to make Hellraiser movies every so often just to keep the titles. So
yeah,
we're just like
they
whoever has
just
a
slap,
script, we're gonna slap Pinhead on there and call it a
slap,
day.
yeah, they just slap Hellraiser onto the thing. Okay, that works.
Uh,
It's just
but
ridiculous. Just let the Hellraiser name go. Come on, you're just making crap.
uh, but it is Nightmare on Elm Street is and we're gonna be talking about this again when I come back for Saw, but it's something that I do really just appreciate about this franchise, especially putting in its time, is that it's like, and that is it's the one credit that I have to give to Dream Child because it's like, this was a big step into Freddy's past. And I do, even
Yeah,
though I don't like what they did, I appreciate that it makes sense in the world.
yeah,
Um, because they could have screwed that up very easily. And it's,
yeah.
it
I think
helps
they do a
further
good
the
job at not contradicting anything really through these movies.
yeah.
Even with number two being kind of separate, in a lot of ways, it messes with his powers and abilities quite a bit. But as you get farther along, they kind of, you know, it's not out there for me anyway. Like I'm like, fine, it's whatever, I don't care. So, um, but
The other
yeah,
thing that I will, just because
go
I
ahead.
feel bad, I harped a lot about Dream Child. The one other really cool thing that I do like about Dream Child, is it has one of, I'm not going to say my favorite, because I think pretty much all of those go to Dream Warrior, or yeah, Dream Warriors. But it does have one of the most interesting death sequences, I think,
Okay.
with the comic.
Oh yes.
I do really like that. It's visually very fantastic. They did a good job with
Yeah.
that one.
I
And
think overall, yeah,
yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I just like I'm not a huge fan of the deaths overall in Dream
Right.
Child, but they do have one of the like standouts for me. So
Yeah, I
and
think like I would say like generally speaking, because of the nature of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, because of the dream logic aspect of it, that you get the more creative kills, overall in this series than you do with just like, any normal run of the mill slasher. It's kind of hard to be original and interesting with your kills when you're just a straight ahead, guy with a knife or guy with a machete or something like that. And so it's that's what makes Nightmare on Elm Street interesting, is like, okay, so what is he going to do? How is he going to use um something against them? And that's what's always kind of interesting about it, is like he always uses their they're something in their personality against them. So
it gives like
that
a
is
very
always a fun thing.
personal aspect to all the
Yeah.
deaths. It's one of my biggest complaints about Dream Child actually is that I feel like even though the ideas are kind of there to make the deaths personal, I feel like they didn't hit as hard as in because the characters aren't as well developed in this one. So
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to be like, here's a really personal element. I think it's one area where the comic death is more personal to the comic artist.
Yeah.
But I do feel like they faltered a lot. Well, Dan's death, I is one of the most frustrating things because like it's Dan doesn't have a ton of personality between
Yeah.
Dream Master and Dream Child, but the
No.
one thing that they give and then they give him a vehicular death, which I it's kind of because the truck almost was a character in Dream Master. Like they're in that thing so much, and then the
Yeah.
truck is still here in five, and then he like there's a dream sequence with the car. He doesn't take it. He takes like this motorcycle that we've never seen, and then becomes one with it. And it's like, I I just that's so indicative of my problem with the Dream Child deaths, where it's like on they were so close to having like a through line from the last movie, and they didn't quite figure out, that Dan drives a truck. Like they so
Yeah.
close.
Yeah. I mean, he does have a bike in his truck bed in the first movie. So I mean, but I mean,
Yeah.
but I mean, it was a different bike. So I mean, it's just like, I mean, at least it makes sense that he could drive a motorcycle. So
Yeah. And like it's a cool death. Like visually, I think the bike was a lot, more visually appealing than probably what they would have done with the truck. But he essentially Dan gets two death scenes, and the one that makes the last sense is how he actually dies,
yeah.
which is just like a lot of it felt like padding, like when they did have personal elements in Dream Child, and that's unfortunate.
All right. That's all I have on these two movies. Unless you have anything else.
No, although because the episodes aren't out yet, can I ask what your favorite one is?
My
Your
favorite of the whole series.
of the whole series?
I would say probably number one. It's kind of hard to fault number
Same.
one.
It is.
It's um looking at I did a ranking. Yeah, number one's my favorite. It's kind of tied with New Nightmare, really, because I think that you know the what he does with New Nightmare, you know, is kind of an expansion on his ideas that he had in number one. So I think
Yeah,
they make a nice little combo, really, for me. So,
they do.
but yeah, those are my top two of the whole thing, and they're tied. So,
That's
and what's yours?
I Oh, mine is also one. I see a lot of I the two that I always seem to hear about are one and three. So I'm always
One and
kind of
three,
curious
yeah,
on like which Dream Warriors, fantastic movie, very very well done. But I do kind of like to see where people fall on that because it. So yeah, but one
so yeah.
is
So
one starts
Dream
it.
Warriors, for anybody wanting to know, for me is my number four. So, so mine goes Nightmare on Elm Street, New Nightmare, then Freddy versus Jason.
Oh wow, wow, above Dream Warriors.
Yeah,
Wow,
I don't hold the same nostalgia for Dream Warriors.
that's
So
fair.
like it's funny though, because when I was a kid, we used to be like, because don't get me wrong, when I was a kid and we watched this movie and everything like that, my friends and I, we would always talk about it, and we would talk about, oh, what powers would we have in our dreams and stuff like that. So it definitely had a big impact on me when I was a kid. But because I hadn't really watched these in so long, um, and I don't like, so I have a fairly bad memory. So I don't have, this is what's interesting, is just I just don't have the same nostalgia for things. Um,
Yeah,
so I don't get the kind of like look back and go, oh, how did I feel about that? And so it doesn't have that, I don't have that, like I can't feel that same way like a lot of people can when it comes down to it. So I can appreciate the Dream Warriors is definitely one of the better movies. So,
yeah.
but it's for me, I think one New Nightmare and then Freddy versus Jason. Because again, I think that those three do the best job of distilling what Freddy is.
They do.
And while Dream Warriors is a good and fun story, it's part of the middle group of movies that kind of start to kind of veer off the path for me. So in little ways, like I think that they still do a good job at telling the Freddy story, and that they have interesting characters and stuff like that. I think all of these are generally pretty good. Like, the only two that I think, the only three that I think are really bad are Final Nightmare, Dream Child, and the remake. I think everything else is generally pretty good. And here's my hot take, is that other than one major thing in the remake, I think the remake's actually decent. It's well acted, the characters are pretty good, and the actors are good in it. It's just, one thing in that. So
I don't see a lot of I don't see a lot of people defending the remake. So
no. I like, most people revile the remake. It's literally, and don't get me wrong, because of the one thing, I kind of understand it. So
yeah.
But outside of that, I think that there's it's I think that if they remake it again, if they kind of go, and I don't want to see them remake it. I don't want to see a remake where they kind of tell the same story again. I want them to kind of do a requel type thing where they continue the story in some way, in a different way, but kind of picking up things from actually from Wes Craven's ideas and stuff like that in a better way. So, but we'll see if they ever get to it.
Oh, I would like to see, like, it's one of those, I'm part of the problem, because I very much am like, I want new horror movies, I want standalone horror, and to my credit, I do go out to see a lot of what I think at the time are going to be standalone horror movies before they get picked up, if they do well. But then there is also that part of my brain that's like, I would kill for one more Nightmare on Elm Street
movie
if they did it right.
And that's the thing. So here's my thing though, too. Like, I don't mind, like, because there's enough stories to be told that, like, I want that all too. I want brand new stories that nobody's ever put out before. Like, that'd be great. Like, 100%. And I think people are doing that. That's why we have Shudder and Screambox. We have these two pretty good networks now, streaming services that give us plenty of choice and opportunity for that kind of stuff. And besides theatrical release. And so and besides that, I mean, we still got Netflix and everybody else who's actually still doing the horror stuff, to greater or lesser degrees. But I still want to see a new Nightmare on Elm Street. I still want to see a new Jason movie. If they continue Michael Myers' story in some way, shape, or form, I'll go watch it. So the I will most likely go watch a lot of the major stuff when they come out with something interesting and it looks good whenever it comes out. If it, like, I hadn't watched the new Nightmare until today. I think I tried to watch it years ago, and I think I fell asleep while watching it just because I was tired. Not because it was boring. Because upon watching it, I didn't think it was a boring movie at all. But I just hadn't. And I've had it for a while, and I just never watched it. It just I wanted to get through all the other ones first again before I watched the new one, and so it's just one of those things where eventually I'll get to them. But I thought the new Friday the 13th, the 2009 Friday the 13th was good. So if they do something along those lines, and I know they're doing a series, they're coming out with a Crystal Lake series that's going to tap into all the movies and the mythology, which should be interesting. But maybe if they did something like that with Freddy, we got the Chucky series, we've got the upcoming Jason series, so maybe they could do a Freddy series, something like that would explore the mythology.
I would love to see something like that, because Freddy is just, I think, and we talked about it already, it's what made him so iconic, but he's just entertaining.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and it's always nice to have you on. So why don't you let people know where they can find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at cat_Voleur. That's Voleur. You can check out my website and pre-order my book from catvoleur.com.
Yes, definitely do that. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Kat for joining me, and she'll be back on the show this Friday to discuss Iron Man 2 for my ongoing series looking at the MCU. And next Monday, Hugh McStay joins me for the finale of this Nightmare on Elm Street series with Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving the show 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, please share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at creepyandgeeky.com. Music for the podcast composed by Jerry Smith. You can follow the podcast on social media at Creepy and Geeky on both Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to follow me, I'm Geek Thulu on Twitter and geek.thulu on Instagram. You can support the podcast by ordering teas and more on TeePublic or by donating to the Ko-fi page. All of the links are in the show notes. Finally, don't forget, stay creepy.